morning, everyone. Welcome to Hair of the Dog on the DLF Network. Happy Monday. For those of you who are joining us from the West Coast, please stay safe. We see what's going on, and it's terrifying. So shout out to all of you just waking up again to apocalypse sky, but please stay safe. So I am here in Illinois. It's cool. It's overcast. So far quiet. Andy, good morning. How are things up in Canada, our northern neighbors?
Well, as far as I can tell, it's good morning, by the way. As far as I can tell, it's a lot cooler and there's a lot less fire.
Right. That's exactly. Well, I was looking at, I have friends in Colorado, and I was looking at the weather forecast because that's what I do. And their weather forecast has freezing areas, snow, and fire on their forecast as well. So parts of Colorado up in the mountains and surrounding areas in the plains, those are struggling with fire issues as well. So climate change is real.
If you could get them to all occur at the same time in the same place, they pretty much basically cancel each other out.
Right, but that's not happening. So yeah, so you have great swaths of fire in Colorado as well.
Mm-hmm.
Not in the Denver area, but to the west and to the east. So Denver is surrounded by it, and Denver sits in a bowl. So they're having the same air quality issues in places around metro area. So it's
Denver doesn't have any air.
Denver does have air. It's just a higher.
They don't have any. Ask any Pittsburgh Steelers player that's played there.
Yeah, well, ask him about the drive too, because that didn't happen in Denver. So
semantics,
right?
Details.
Exactly. So we are continuing this morning with a theme that we have done last week. We started with the myth of the monolithic Latino voter, and this segment is particularly geared towards Anglos because we tend to view other cultures and people as just this great nebulous group of voters, like the black vote, and here we have the Latino vote. And so it was a curious thing with Latinos for Trump. How could this be when we as Anglos are looking at immigration policy and all of these other things? So we're going through this to help educate the rest of the country, in particular white people, white Anglos, that no, we have such a rich, diverse heritage amongst the groups within the Latino community. And if we're going to understand it, then we can reach out and talk to them about the issues that matter to them, things that maybe we haven't even considered, which is important to do because the GOP has been doing it for a long time and reaping the benefits, particularly in Florida and other places. So we're going through that. And we started part one with a look at Mexican Latinos and how the whole concept of white as a construct is a myth. The way that Anglos look at white and the way that other groups within the United States look at white are completely different. And we need to understand that version of othering. And then we moved into the Cuban question. So why are Cuban Americans more likely to be conservative at a certain age level? And then we spoke to Mike Toller, who is the first generation Cuban American born in this country, and he spoke about his family and how they react to certain words based on their own family history in immigrating from Cuba. So today we're going to look at Puerto Rico because Puerto Rico has been in the news for years, particularly after Hurricane Maria, and we saw what was happening. I forget who was right before Maria, but there were like two back to back, and how it decimated the island. And as a consequence of what was going on in the conversation, you had so many Americans in the continental U.S. not realize that Puerto Ricans are American, including our own president. So we want to talk about that experience and then the dichotomy that we have in every family where like my grandparents and my parents were hardcore conservative. Like my mother was a diehard Trump supporter, whereas I'm not. So where is this divide happening, and how do we use this information to have better conversations across the political spectrum and within our families? So this morning,
it's extremely interesting, and it's going to be a very fascinating conversation as far as I'm concerned. And I just think Puerto Rico is just so important to touch on, just because it's such a unique society. But when we delve into it, we see how poorly the country, Puerto Rico, has been treated, and the messaging. We know that, as reprehensible as you might believe that Republicans are as a political group, or at least they do messaging well. They are masters of messaging, and I think that we find over the last decades that we're looking at how mainstream media and the political environment has messaged the Puerto Rican people and the colony. And I'm old enough that I remember the television shows of the 70s and 80s, where a lot of times anyone of Puerto Rican heritage is shown as the bad guy, the criminal, and how for the last 5-6 decades that's instilled a certain way of thinking in the vast majority of American people. And it's important as a group that we dispel that, right? That we give Puerto Ricans a chance to speak about their own existence, their own environment, and what it's like.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that goes across the board, when we look at these pictures and narratives that are given to us. And it's always with the caveat, well, the stereotypes have a grain of truth in them. And is that really true? Because, the whole image of the clown, the Ronald McDonald, that came from the British diminishing the Irish. So, no. So yeah, Andy, to your point, we're going to get through a lot of this, but we're still just scratching the surface. We can take this from purely economic to cultural to all of these things, but today we're just going to look at a very narrow focus. And I'd like to start with Julia González. Excuse me, I have allergies today from all the rain we got here in Chicago, but Julia González was kind enough to share with us kind of a video log that she did over a couple days because she's busy, she's working. So she could not join us live this morning, but thank you to Julie for giving us her video documentary on her experience from her family. So this may not apply to you and your family, but I think she makes some really great points here that are worth considering and just kind of sit with and listen to what she has to say. So it's about 7 minutes long. And for those of you who are just joining us, yes, we do take your comments and questions live on air. So thank you to everybody who's weighing in. But as soon as this video wraps, we'll get to comments and questions, and then we're going to introduce a very special guest to you this morning. So here is the testimony from Julie. Take a listen.
Hello everybody, I am Julia González and I am so glad to be here recording a video for the Hair of the Dog Digital Liberation Front. I know you guys don't know me, so let me introduce myself. I am proud Puerto Rican living in Durham, North Carolina, and Kerri approached to me and asked me to share a video where I talk about my story and also about how historic events and culture play a role in conservatism in Puerto Rico. So let's do it. Let's start. I was born in San Juan, but raised in Bayamón, Puerto Rico, both city areas. I was a 90s kid who was part of the low/middle class of the island, but I had the chance to get a good quality education. I have a bachelor's degree in secondary education history with a minor in popular music. I have a master's degree in teaching English as a second language, and nowadays I work as an ESOL coordinator in a high school. So it is a new day. I'm going to continue sharing my story now. I was too tired to finish yesterday, so let's do it. I was a teacher in Puerto Rico. The money that I used to make there as a teacher wasn't enough to cover my basic needs. And I mean, I used to survive. I used to get summer jobs, but the last year I spent there, I couldn't find a job and during the summer, and I still needed to pay my bills. Then the Hurricane Maria hit the island and made everything worse. I lost my car. The school I was working at was about to close. Not to mention I didn't have any power or running water. The grocery stores were almost empty, and I found myself in a really difficult position. So I had friends in Raleigh who offered their help. They told me to come here and start over, and so I did. And I have to say, it has been quite a transition, but it worked out. And this is how I got to the US mainland, and now this is my home. Now, let's talk about Puerto Rico. Specifically, how history and culture play a role in conservatism in the island. First, Puerto Rico. It's a colony. It has always been. First, 400 years under Spain, now 122 years under the United States, after Spain lost the Hispanic-American War. And therefore, our mentality, our colonial mentality, is part of what people believe as a fact, consciously or unconsciously. And what is colonial mentality? Well, it is when people internalize that they are inferior than the colonizer, and they want to feel like they belong. In this case, they deny being Latinos, they deny our African roots, just to feel more like what they think it is to be an American. So conservative people in Puerto Rico, usually they talk in third person plural. They don't include themselves as Puerto Ricans. They don't think we are capable of taking our own decisions. One of the biggest cliche arguments they have is the economic dependency Puerto Rico has from the United States. And they claim that the reason why that is, it's because Puerto Ricans are lazy, because Puerto Ricans want everything to be done for them and all of that. But what they don't know is that this statement is actually the biggest proof of their colonial mentality. And I'm going to explain you why. Even though Puerto Ricans back to 1898 and the beginning of 20th century already had a colonial mentality, under United States was different because they had an Americanization plan, which intended to assimilate the population and destroy Puerto Rican culture. So what they did was to use the two social institutions for mind controlling: church and education. Okay, education. They used it to shape people's minds and future generations as well. Religion. They used it to convert Puerto Ricans to their faith, of course, Protestant denominations. Most of the population back then was Catholic because of the Spaniard influence. But the biggest impact was in the economy. Americans destroyed all Puerto Rican economic activities, which they were mostly based on coffee and other products back then. Americans imposed their economic models. Back then, sugar was a big business, so they built humongous factories all over the island, what people used to call centrales azucareras. At some point, Puerto Rico just looked like a big garden of sugar cane. There was no even space available for people to plant their own food. So everything needed to be imported. And guess who was going to import all those products? You guessed it right, United States. In addition to that, all the jobs available were the jobs that these factories could offer to people. Usually they were seasonal, way underpaid, and it was just to cut sugar cane. So economically, this pattern continued. Americans kept bringing their businesses to the island. Puerto Ricans were the cheap labor arms they needed. Same thing goes with the assistance provided by the government. For example, the food stamps, what we call cupones. So first, there's no way anyone can make a living off of that. It's not enough money to do it. So there's that. And people have to keep in mind that this money that the government is providing is meant to be spent in products that Americans shipped to the island, and American products as well. In other words, Americans, United States, it's not going to spend a penny if they are not going to get profit. So this so-called dependency that we have, it's not our fault. It's a consequence of colonialism. But conservative people are not going to be able to understand that. And I don't blame them. They don't have the proper education to have this information and to analyze it. Most of them are religious, mostly Protestant denominations, of course. And one characteristic that religion has is that make people docile. I mean, even slavery was justified by religion. They used to use it to control enslaved people's minds and to make them submissive. To conclude, the historic events right after Spain lost the Hispanic American War changed Puerto Rican culture forever. And the growing number of conservative people in the island is just an outcome of the Americanization process. So this is my point of view from my own perspective, knowledge, and experiences. As you noticed, I recorded chunks of my answer at home, at work, but after work hours, of course. And but I finished. You know, that's my life. I have a million things to do, but I finished my video. Overall, I would like to know what do you think about this topic. So please let me know. And I hope you all have a good night. Bye.
Okay, so that was Julia. Thank you so much, Julia, for your testimony there and describing your experience. We always feel like it's better to have the people who come from this culture or the situation speak on it rather than us talking about them. So I really appreciate Julia weighing in on that. And she really had some great points there. So I would invite everyone to go back and watch her statement again, especially if you're in an activism component or you're running for office or working for a campaign. These are important things that you need to keep in mind when you're talking to people, because we all come from different experiences, different backgrounds, and there are some really salient points that Julie made about how to reach people and really listen and solve the problems that are concerns for them. So we're going to switch gears a little bit, and we have a live guest today that is a remarkably talented filmmaker. This is an Emmy award-winning filmmaker. So I invite you for your questions and all of your comments. Please weigh in. This is JUAN Agustín
Márquez.
Thank you. I forewarned you.
Allergies.
No worries.
Yeah, I warned you before we got started that I'm not with it with these allergies. It's crazy. So, but thank you for your patience this morning. So, I did post a link to the documentary that you made. I believe it was 2015. But it's still so relevant today because these questions haven't gotten answered. So this is The Last Colony. And so I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the issues that were raised during the filming of this documentary that are still unaddressed today, and what the rest of us in the continental United States are completely getting wrong about the Puerto Rico issue. So welcome.
Thank you for having me. It's great to always have a platform to talk about Puerto Rico. Like the film, you know, the subtitle of the film is "We Need to Talk About Puerto Rico." So this is very welcome opportunity to discuss some of the issues that affect my people.
I think for me, when I was watching it, the opener was jarring to me because it forced me as an American living in the continental United States to really take a hard look in the mirror, because you open with the Constitution. You open with the reading of these passages that we're all supposed to know, and when we pledge allegiance and all of these things. But you point out, I think quite eloquently, that the struggles that we had in the formation of our country is identical to what Puerto Rico is going through and has gone through for, over 100 years. So
Well, Puerto Rico is the oldest colony in the world, not just by the colonization of the United States, but also by the Spanish colonization. So Puerto Rico has always been a colony. It's definitely when we call it the last colony, there's a meaning behind that name, and I understand when people have their issues with that because there's definitely other colonies. But without a doubt, it is the oldest colony in the world. So Puerto Rico, as far as it's been a colony for 500 years. So it's the issues that the people, Puerto Rico has never had its control. The Puerto Rican people have never had control of the island or our political future. So it's very similar to what the 13 colonies went through, and Puerto Rico needs to decolonize, and the way forward, however, is very different from what the 13 colonies did. Obviously, the 13 colonies went through war. Puerto Rico is a small island that has a population, an internal population of 3.5 million people and a worldwide population of about 8 million people. There's obviously no interest in going to war with the United States. We are American citizens. Most Puerto Ricans don't have a hate towards the metropolis. It's rather a confusing sentiment towards how to deal with the actual relationship with the metropolis. Some Puerto Ricans feel that they are American citizens with a lesser citizenship, and some Puerto Ricans feel that they are Latin American citizens with an American citizenship, with a privileged American citizenship. So there's a difference. That's an internal struggle in terms of how we see ourselves as Puerto Ricans, and how do we see our relationship. And that is what basically we try to discuss in the film, that it's not just, we're not a colony because we haven't figured out, we remain a colony because we're still struggling to define ourselves in which direction we want to go. And we're so divided in this very topic that everything else, every other topic is pushed aside. And this has become a conversation, a never-ending conversation within Puerto Rico that has yielded no results. So that's why we made the film, to try to, as we say, export the conversation, because obviously if we haven't done anything within ourselves, within Puerto Rico, we haven't solved the problem. That's kind of like the definition of insanity, when you try to do the same thing over and over and nothing changes. So by doing the film in English and trying to invite the rest of the United States, if you will, to the conversation, hopefully that's going to create some bigger awareness and create better positions in the United States to help us decolonize, whichever way decolonization may happen. And having said that, when I say whichever way, I personally believe that decolonization is not just independence. A lot of people disagree with me with this sentiment, but I also believe that statehood is a way of decolonizing Puerto Rico. But that is a controversial sentiment that not everybody agrees with me. A lot of Puerto Ricans feel that joining the United States as a state would further colonize Puerto Rico and would perpetuate the colonial situation. I personally believe that Puerto Rico would be better off as an independent nation or as a state, but the colonial situation is really what's keeping us behind.
I think that came across eloquently in just the conversations that you highlighted about how to move forward. So Puerto Ricans get a vote as United States citizens, but they don't get representation in Congress. So it's kind of this...
No, we don't get a vote. We don't get a vote.
No. Okay.
No vote. No vote whatsoever. The only thing that we get is a resident commissioner that represents Puerto Rico, but now in the House of Representatives, which will be an equivalent to a congressperson. And that congressperson, our resident commissioner, does not get a vote. So we have a representative with a voice without a vote. And if we were a state, that's just one person that represents 3.5 million people on the island. If we were a state, we would get either 6 or 7, depending on the actual population at the moment. We would get 6 or 7 members of Congress as representatives, and obviously 2 senators as every other state. So no, we don't get to vote. And what could be very confusing to any audience is that you might hear in the news that sometimes Puerto Rico, especially in the primaries, we do get to vote in the primaries. So it's confusing. It's nonsensical, but it's.
So you get to vote in the primary to determine who's in the general election, but you don't get to vote in the general?
That's right.
That's insane. And I think that that's probably counter to what most Americans think or understand, right? That's almost like we're going to allow you to vote in the primary to give the illusion that you're allowed to vote in the general.
Yes. And another topic, not just in terms of voting rights, but I think there's also a myth about taxation in Puerto Rico. I think a lot of people think that there's no taxes in Puerto Rico because there's, quote unquote, taxation without representation. And that's not true. Puerto Ricans do pay taxes, not just very high local taxes, but also, there's some taxes that Puerto Ricans don't pay, but we do pay some federal taxes in some other forms. That the myth of go to Puerto Rico, there's no taxation down there. It's completely false. And it's been, it's something that I remember having a conversation as a child or as a teenager with a high school friend in the United States where I went to school, where I was explaining that we had a resident commissioner, and he said, well, you have representation, so you should be taxed. And I was like, well, no, you're oversimplifying the situation. We don't have representation. We have a guy that has a voice, but the taxation without representation is a very real situation in Puerto Rico.
Actually, Kerri, I can speak to that based on a conversation with Warren Mosler. And a couple of years ago, Warren ran for Congress or for representation in the U.S. Virgin Isles where he lives. And he was explaining the economy there. And he said that what happens is, because it's not in the continental United States or considered a state, that the money that they get from taxes is what their budget is. And there's no extra. Because if you're in the United States, if you're in the continent, you may pay your state taxes, right? But what happens is the transfers back to the state from the federal government are a factor of about 1.3 to 1, which means that you're getting 0.3 above what you've paid in state taxes to the federal government. Well, the difference is in the U.S. Virgin Islands and in Puerto Rico, they're basically just strapped by the fact that they can spend the money that they take in. So it's 1 to 1. So they're already at a disadvantage monetarily because of the economic policies in these satellite regions, right?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So not only do we have a lack of representation through a vote, I mean, we've seen it where a politician, especially when it comes to progressive policy, can go on the floor of Congress and make his case all day long and still not move because he doesn't get a vote. So you have the same situation with District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, Virgin Islands. And then at the same time, we've put financial constraints on that. So Juan, before we got started, I talked to you a little bit about Hurricane Maria, and we saw the devastation that happened, but then it was an education for us here in the U.S. because we learned that parts of the island were still without power except for this one area where you had these big manufacturing companies, particularly for medical equipment. Like here in Illinois, we had to delay surgeries because we couldn't get the IV bags. Well, the IV bags were being manufactured by a Baxter subsidiary in Puerto Rico that was struggling, not just with electricity, but once they got it on, they couldn't get employees in because the employees themselves were not getting food and shelter and all of the things that they needed to work in the factories that did have electricity. So in your documentary, you don't delve too much into that kind of disparity, but do you not think this is something important that not only relates to the politics of it, but the way the people view themselves and you know, their American counterparts in the continental U.S.?
Well, let's start with the fact that Puerto Rico used to be the worldwide hub of the pharmaceutical industry. And the reason why that happened was because precisely of our colonial situation. The pharmaceutical industry arrived at Puerto Rico as a tax incentive. Tax incentives are what has attracted the pharmaceutical industry to Puerto Rico. And the fact, like you mentioned, when Maria happened, you know, and some of those pharmaceutical industries, some pharmaceutical companies had to halt operations, then you start seeing the effects of not taking care of Puerto Rico in the United States. Well, obviously, the problem is it's way bigger than just what happened with pharmaceuticals. You know, the problem was a humanitarian crisis within Puerto Rico. But the pharmaceutical industry in Puerto Rico has been losing its footing because those incentives are almost gone now. So now we don't have most of the manufacturing that used to provide most of the high-paying wages in Puerto Rico, and those jobs have disappeared. And there's a little bit of there's a lot of political history behind that. The statehood party in Puerto Rico has always been against the presence of the pharmaceutical industry because the statehood party in Puerto Rico sees the pharmaceutical industry as an impediment for statehood, because if you have these big companies in Puerto Rico benefiting from our colonial relationship, you cannot have statehood, you know, because the pharmaceutical industry benefits from our colonial relationship. So you have the party that has this is basically, you know, they have tried to do everything to get rid of those incentives, which sound good. You know, you do want these companies to pay taxes, but the problem is that when you take out what we have found out is that when you take out incentives, they don't stay, they leave. So now what has happened was that the statehood party, in an effort to remove those incentives and make Puerto Rico closer to a state, what they really have done is and the manufacturing in Puerto Rico and a lot of high-paying wages. So it's one of those situations that a lot of people don't see or understand, but there, you know, it's so complex how the status of Puerto Rico is not just a social issue, but the economics of it and the laws that affect and all that. It's so far-reaching that it's very hard to comprehend how big of an impact it has to be a colony of the United States.
Oh yeah.
As any colony, you know, the colonies are meant for the profit and for the benefit of the metropolis. You know, that's the other myth that we have to destroy. That, you know, Puerto Rico is a colony. It's benefited from being a colony of the United States. You know that's never been the case in colonial history. But having said that, like my professor Emilio Pantoja, a historian. Puerto Rican historian, told me, you know, the only worst thing that being a colony, an American colony of the United States in the Caribbean, is not being an American colony in the Caribbean. So it's one of those things that you know, we're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place.
Right, absolutely. I think that really came through in the piece that you did, The Last Colony. Real quick, I want to get to some of the comments that came in while we were talking. First is Mike, when we were talking about the difference between do you get a vote in the primary or the general, Mike points out that the primaries are run by private organizations, the parties, which are corporations, and they set their own rules for those. And he points out that the DNC did say that they don't have to follow their own rules. So he's right. The RNC and the DNC, these are private corporate entities that run their own races and set their own rules. So that could be why you get a vote in the primary, but not in the general. Still not okay in my mind.
That's the legal pathway. That is absolutely true. That doesn't make it right or clear, but that is true.
Great point.
But the end result is that it gives people shows people a facade that Puerto Ricans are voting in the elections when in fact they're not.
I'm guilty. I believed it. So I chalked that up to. I learned something really important today.
And we should add the participation in those primaries is very low. Especially in the Republican primary in Puerto Rico, it's extremely low. It's barely, you can barely register, as opposed to a general election where if you see the film, a general election in Puerto Rico, it's a, you basically have to shut down the island in a couple of days of activity, Wow. So the primaries is a very, very limited in scope in terms of what the participation.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. And then
they just recently had a soccer match that there were more goals scored in that soccer match than there were actual people that voted in the election.
Exactly.
Right. Oh, I believe it. So then we have a comment from Noble. Noble says the U.S. empire is crumbling, and it's a good time to declare independence from the U.S. The U.S. government has long been usurped by kleptocrats and oligarchs. None of us have representation. So he begs a good question. We've seen this over the course of several years where 3 independent universities declared that the U.S. is no longer a representational democracy. We're a failed democracy, and in many cases moved into oligarchy. So he's got a point. So now your film, your documentary was 2015. Now fast forward 5 years, a lot has changed. And you feature 4 incidents of what is called a plebiscite. So can you explain for our viewers what a plebiscite is so that they can understand? Because we don't have that term in the continental U.S.
A plebiscite is basically an election. It's a vote that does not is not to elect an official. Basically, in the States, the equivalent would be a proposition. When you say I had to look up. I forgot the word. Proposition. When they say proposition to legalize same-sex marriage or legalize cannabis and stuff like that. That's kind of like the equivalent to a plebiscite in Puerto Rico. And Puerto Rico has had, for the film, at the moment of the film, we had 4 plebiscites. Now I believe we're up to 6. We've done 6 plebiscites. Since we presented the film in 2015, there's been basically 1 plebiscite, an extra plebiscite. And now this year, there's going to be a yes or no vote for statehood, which is also the first time it's ever been done. So but it's also these plebiscites are also political tools to attract people to vote. There's a huge discontent with the 2 main political parties in Puerto Rico. And like we discussed in the film, the parties in Puerto Rico are wrapped around the status issue. Oh. So they do these plebiscites, especially the statehood party does these plebiscites to attract people to vote for statehood when they know that the party is suffering because people haven't liked their candidates and corruption is a humongous situation that we have to address.
So are you saying that they're actually using it as a fundraising tool? Is that?
Where they use the plebiscites to try to attract to make their base come out and vote.
Okay.
Because the statehood issue or the independence issue or the Commonwealth issue, that's what spearheads the political conversation in Puerto Rico. So they use plebiscites to, when they know they're going to lose, to try to bring out people to vote for their cause.
Gotcha. So let me ask you this: as I went through and watched the documentary, and this honestly, this was my introduction into what was going on. So this next question may sound completely ignorant, but it sounded like the conversations were amongst yourselves, and yet there was a segment of information that you were missing. Like, you could not make an informed decision without representatives from the U.S. saying, okay, well, if you do option A, here's what we will do. If you decide option B, here's what we will do. So how can anybody in the island of Puerto Rico make a decision one way or another when you've got Big Brother who isn't necessarily weighing in?
That is precisely why we made the film. The Independence Party taught me a phrase that I think it's crucial to that question is they say the mute has to speak, el mudo tiene que hablar, which means that the Independence Party especially have labeled the United States as the mute because they're being conveniently quiet. The federal government has been conveniently quiet in terms of how to solve the status. They always say, well, you guys solve it and then we'll say. And that, that doesn't really help Puerto Rico. And that's why my words have been sometimes confused in the media when I've explained that I think the best way to get the mute to speak is to vote for statehood. A lot of people have understood that as an endorsement for statehood. But that's more of a personal strategy that I see if we force the United States to reckon with the fact that Puerto Rico requests statehood, that is going to force them to assume a position. So when I have advocated for a statehood vote, it's not that I necessarily favor statehood as my preferred status option, but I think voting for statehood and saying that all of Puerto Rico wants statehood would be the way to get the mute to speak. And a lot of people speculate that they will say, well, no, you won't get it. But until we get that reaction, all we're getting is, well, you guys haven't decided yet. So until you guys make up your mind, we can't make up our mind, which again doesn't help. It's Big Brother, as you say, could step in. I could say, hey, this is what we're prepared to offer under statehood. And if you want independence, this is how we're prepared to do it. They could have an initiative, but it's been conveniently quiet and letting us fight amongst ourselves in this topic.
Right. It almost seems like it's a little manipulative. So here's a thought. So we have the push for the Black Lives Matter to get change in police reform and how we relate to each other as American citizens. Could we not do the same thing for Puerto Rico? So, for example, in New York, Florida, Chicago, Los Angeles, where you have high populations of Puerto Ricans who have moved on to other places in the country. We know these people. They're friends of ours. We work with them. Would it be of benefit if we started doing our own non-binding referendums in like Illinois and New York on the question of Puerto Rico statehood?
That would be, personally, I think that would be amazing, but I find that unlikely to happen. But I think that would be amazing if cities or states started assuming positions on Puerto Rico status. And, I always say that, I went to college in Ithaca College, and you could see everywhere bumper stickers of Free Tibet. And it makes you wonder, why do people in upstate New York have such a strong opinion about Tibet, but they have no idea about their own colony? I remember when Joe the plumber back in the 2012 election had thoughts about Israel and what the United States should be doing with Israel. It's like, why do so many people have strong opinions about Tibet and Israel and have zero clue about even how to start a conversation about Puerto Rico? So again, that's why we made the film, to be able to spark conversation. Hopefully we're going to start seeing some bumper stickers, not necessarily saying free Puerto Rico, but at least decolonize Puerto Rico.
Right.
That would be my ideal slogan, decolonize.
Or at least listen to Puerto Ricans.
Yes, yeah.
Right? Because I think that the number one issue, and this is from what I've observed, I've been to Puerto Rico a couple of times, and I stayed in the old city, and for the most part, you don't leave the new or the old city and go out into where the actual people are. And I found it extremely strange that any of the people that we talked to, you don't want to go out there, almost like they are embarrassed about that part of the country, right? And that's horrible. But the question you have to ask is, why do you never hear from Puerto Rican people? And the answer is, it's because they don't have a vehicle to speak. They don't have a voice. Nobody's listening to them. And I think that's the most important thing, is that normal, working class, poor Puerto Rican people need to be heard, and they're not.
Yes, and we piggyback on the representation in New York and Florida, basically, to be heard. We have these Puerto Rican of Puerto Rican descent, or even Puerto Rican-born congressmen and women that are in New York. Like Nidia Velázquez, Luis Gutierrez, Jose Serrano, and Puerto Ricans have relied heavily on those voices, but those are not, they don't really represent Puerto Rico, they represent New York. So it's again, we don't have that voice. And that's why, you mentioned Black Lives Matter. That's why, representation in films and things like that matter so much, because and that's why I'm personally so excited. And this might sound ridiculous, but I'm so excited about the new Spider-Man being half Puerto Rican, half Black, because that might not seem like a big deal, but eventually people, the fact that such a big, important character like Spider-Man now is his name is Miles Morales, and there's two, you still have Peter Parker from New York, but you have this Miles Morales that help advance the conversation of Puerto Rico.
Now, do you mind if I ask you, I don't know if you wanted to speak on this, but when Hurricane,
I think we lost Kerri. Did we lose her?
Yeah, I think it's just her camera went out. It'll probably come back on in a second. But I just wanted to ask you about when we have when the hurricane came through, and obviously we understand. We saw the pictures. We saw the devastation. I think the hurricane, as horrible as it was, did for Puerto Rico what in a lot of places, a lot of ideas that the pandemic did in especially the United States, and showed some of the weaknesses, and showed that the capitalists in unfettered capitalist society wasn't capable of dealing with the human nature, the human suffering. Do you find that, and moreover, on top of that, what's your opinion of Mayor Julia Cruz and how she was thrust into the spotlight in Maria? Because we all remember the pictures of her standing in armpit deep water, trying to find people in the floods, and then later her Twitter war with the orange orangutan. So if what are your thoughts on that?
Well, that's a great. Let's start with the Orange Menace. The Orange Menace plane after Hurricane Maria, that Puerto Rico, big water, surrounded by water, and he made it seem like he's never been there. But the fact is that before he was in politics, he had been many times in Puerto Rico. He had businesses in Puerto Rico. he actually went bankrupt in Puerto Rico. He with his Miss Universe, he had 2 Miss Universe pageants in Puerto Rico. So when he becomes president, he all of a sudden forgot about Puerto Rico. It was like, no, you cannot even claim to be ignorant about these issues, because he made it seem that he just discovered Puerto Rico, when in fact he had a lot of presence in Puerto Rico before he was a politician. So that was a big thing that kind of surprised, it doesn't surprise us that we will get that treatment, but he's kind of like surprised, like he just discovered Puerto Rico and how far it was. That was just, he had been there many times. And so but we know how big of a monster he is. But let's talk about Carmen Yulín. Carmen Yulín Cruz, the mayor of San Juan at the time, and she's still the mayor of San Juan. She rose herself to the national level with her Twitter and with her war with Trump, and the liberal media picked it up and made her a darling, which they were not wrong about, but they painted a picture that she was the hero. And in fact, she just lost the primary in Puerto Rico. She's not getting the love within Puerto Rico that the media portrayed for her. Apparently, and I haven't lived in Puerto Rico in during the last 4 years. I didn't personally saw her work as a mayor, but all my friends in Puerto Rico tell me, you see it all the time, that she has been a disaster as a mayor. So it's one of those things that yes, she was right to be vocal against Trump, but we have to be careful to paint her as a hero, because her constituents don't even think that she's a hero. So it was very easy to paint her in a brushstroke, and she represents the strong female voice. It's kind of like a bit of the conversation got lost in terms of what her work has been.
And again, that goes to the fact that the voices of the people that should weigh in on this go unheard, right?
Yes. But going back to the other question about what Hurricane Maria brought to the spotlight, yes, a lot of bad things happened in Puerto Rico, but a lot of good happened, and a lot of attention got brought to Puerto Rico, which was quite frankly needed. Jimmy Fallon did this special in Puerto Rico, which was a huge hit. The Tonight Show did this thing, and the outpour of, because of the apathetic take from the federal government towards Puerto Rico was so obvious, the private sector and Hollywood and a lot of good hearted American citizens actually stepped it up, and that was also beautiful to see. But that's kind of like what you get when you have such an imbecile president. People have to step it up.
Right. I think you touched on a point that the point that I focus on today, because it's not just Puerto Rico now, it's the rest of us starting to understand and feel that kind of pressure, is that, and it goes back, I think they've used it in movies and other things, but when things are at their worst, we are at our best. And I think this is what we're seeing now again in the parallels of the Black Lives Matter. These are regular people stepping up. These are not necessarily celebrities and everything else, although they have now. But it's regular people, grandmas and moms and high school and college kids and all of these people stepping up. So it would be nice to see the same thing now, that we are broadening our awareness and getting super woke, to understand more about what's going on in Puerto Rico and Guam. Even in your documentary, I heard somebody say that we'll never become a statehood because look at our proximity, and I immediately went, wait, Hawaii is an island. So
well, and you got Alaska on the other side of another country.
Right, yeah. Exactly. So
Canada's a big ass place.
Right. The fact that Canada hasn't taken it over. But I think it goes to the point that you were making in this documentary. So before we close out here, because we're at the top of the hour, Do you have plans for a follow-up, or is there another project that we can help highlight to expand this conversation?
I really appreciate that. I've had plans, but you know, documentaries are a labor of love, and as you guys know, and on a very personal note, I finished The Last Colony the year my first and only daughter was born. So, you know, now I have an almost 5-year-old that, you know, it occupies a lot of my time. So it's very hard to make the sacrifice, because it is a sacrifice. You know, people think that, you know, movies, you know, every movie makes millions of dollars and all that stuff, but it's really a labor of love that requires a lot of financing. So it's been very hard for me to take a year or 2 or 3, which really is what takes to make a documentary, to actually focus on a follow-up. But I would say that I do have the outline of what would be part 2 and 3 of The Last Colony. And I would say also that we closed the film. The film was released in 2015, but we closed the information of the film in 2013. And since 2013 to now, the history of the amount of things that have happened in Puerto Rico has been, you know, monumental. Not just with Hurricane Maria, but other decisions that courts decisions and stuff like that have deeply affected the status of Puerto Rico right now. Something that we haven't even mentioned, but Puerto Rico right now is ruled by a fiscal control board that was not elected by Puerto Ricans, which, by the way, was put there by President Obama. So, you know, it's one of those things that people think that, oh, Trump. Well, you know, let's not forget that, you know, Democrats haven't always been, you know, perfect for us. So, you know, just having the fiscal control board, Hurricane Maria, some decisions that have happened in the Supreme Court regarding Puerto Rico after my film was released, all those things are worthy topics of the documentary. On top of the fact that, you know, the governor was ousted. You know, we had a Puerto Rico in the summer of 19, where Puerto Rico stopped basically because the governor had this private chat with his top cabinet, which basically they said that we fool even our, you know, they said horrible things. The governor said horrible things about the people of Puerto Rico, and Puerto Rico basically kicked him out. So there's so much to work with in terms of stories, that I really wish that I could, you know, if there's an executive producer out there with $300,000 that wants to make a film, I'm here. Call me.
Right.
How much money do you have in your account right now, Kerri?
Not 300,000. No. Although I would love to. Yeah, no, I don't have it. But hey, if we can help
will you accept a check, a third-party check drawn from foreign accounts?
Right.
I take it Bitcoin if you want.
Nice. Well,
But,
maybe we can help with that. So yeah.
It's one of those things that I have made public my intentions, and I think like I said, I have part 2 and 3 ready. Part 2 being about ready in terms of outline, not in terms of I haven't filmed it yet. But there's the political, there's the economic, there's the cabotage laws, there's the hurricane, there's so many things that have happened after my film closed, and at the same time, so many things keep happening that it's so hard to catch. You know, to make a movie takes, you know, it's not a news report. Mm-hmm. That, you know, something happens and you spit it out in the news at night and that's it. You know, by the time I'm done writing something, you know, a structure for the film, something new happens that would change the film, the story of the film. So it's kind of hard to catch up with the fast evolving history. But hopefully, you know, when my daughter's a bit older and as I grow as a filmmaker, hopefully I'll have the time and the financing resources to finish part 2 and 3 and finish the trilogy, which was really the original intention.
Absolutely. So if somebody does want to, there's a philanthropist watching and they do want to help support this, or maybe even start a GoFundMe for you, how do they reach you?
My phone. Well, my email is available worldwide. You know, you just my parents gave me a very specific name before Google, and my full name, Juan Agustín Marquez. I am the only one. If you look for Juan Marquez, you will find a boxer. But if you look for my middle name, Juan Agustín Marquez, you can easily find me through Facebook or Instagram or my website where you can contact me. So just Google my full name, Juan Agustín Marquez, and that should lead you directly to me.
Perfect. That sounds great. And again, we have just scratched the surface with this entire series looking at all these segments. So please go and check out The Last Colony. Juan did a phenomenal job taking a very complex issue from multiple sides and laying it out so that anyone could understand the background of it. And it's just so important as we move forward, not just with Puerto Rico, but all of us, right? E pluribus unum, that all of us together. So with that, we'll get out of here. Thank you so much to Julia for her vlog, and that was a beautiful representation from her perspective. Juan Agustín Márquez, The Last Colony, thank you for joining us.
Nailed it.
Yay!
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. I really appreciate how you said my name too.
Thank you. The Benadryl is starting to wear off just a little bit. Andy, any last thoughts before we get out of here this morning?
Well, I think we definitely have to have a conversation, a follow-up conversation with Juan if he could grace us again with his presence. And we can talk about, I know, something that's close to your heart, baseball.
Oh.
Yeah. And how Major League Baseball has hamstrung the Puerto Rican athletes who and it was not always like that, but how places like in the Dominican and Cuba and Venezuela, where most of non-American born baseball players come from.
Yeah.
Puerto Rico was hamstrung by Major League Baseball and the U.S. And,
that's right.
And but that's as much as I'm saying, because that's going to be another show.
That's a full conversation in the Olympics. It's a full conversation, and even beauty pageants are part of this conversation.
Awesome. Well, let's get it scheduled. I mean, the football season just started for me, so I'm fine. I'll tune out baseball. But okay, with that, we will get out of here. And the intent on Wednesday is to cover some of the fires and climate change and what different states are doing, barring some catastrophic event that could happen in the next 48 hours. I don't know. Anybody who's got Godzilla and Mothra on their bingo card, you're still up for September and October. So,
and if you could guess it, in the next 2 days, we might send you a T-shirt.
Oh, yeah. There's that. So, okay, so from all of us here with Hair of the Dog on the DLLF Network, we're signing off, but I will give you a teaser. Tomorrow, Brandon Johnson has a phenomenal interview coming out, and we're talking about the loyalty within the military with Tim Bakken, a phenomenal author who wrote his own book just about that subject. So that's coming up tomorrow. So for all of us, take care, stay safe, and we'll see you back here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
We bout that, ayy. Bringing the song, we out here, yeah. Spitting the facts, how it's supposed to be. Hair of the dog, we keeping it G. Whoa.